Have you ever noticed something strange? Out of all the conversations you've had with a narcissist, the one memory they never seem to forget is the moment you were at your weakest. Not the time you supported them, not the sacrifices you made, not the kindness you showed. Instead, they remember that one embarrassing mistake, that painful failure, that moment you broke down in tears, or the secret you trusted them with. And somehow, no matter how much time has passed, they know exactly when to bring it up. Think about that for a second. Why would someone deliberately reopen a wound they know has already healed? Why would they choose humiliation over understanding? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, why does it always happen at the exact moment you begin feeling stronger? That isn't an accident, it's a psychological strategy. Most people assume narcissists enjoy hurting others because they're simply cruel. But cruelty is only the surface. Underneath that behavior is something much more calculated, something that explains why your most humiliating moments become their favorite weapons. By the end of this episode, you'll understand what is actually happening inside the narcissist's mind when they remind you of your most painful memories. And once you understand it, you'll never hear those insults the same way again. Because those moments were never really about your weakness. They were always about protecting theirs. Imagine this. You tell someone about the worst day of your life. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe you were rejected by someone you loved. Maybe you had a panic attack in public. Maybe you made a mistake that still makes you cringe years later. A healthy person hears your story and thinks, I hope they never have to go through that again. A narcissist hears the exact same story and thinks, I know where they bleed. That single difference changes everything. You see, emotionally healthy people use vulnerability to build connection. Narcissists use vulnerability to build control. Every painful memory you share becomes information. Every insecurity becomes leverage. Every confession becomes a future weapon waiting for the perfect moment. And here's what makes it so dangerous. They don't use it immediately, they wait. Sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, until the day arrives when you're finally becoming confident again. Maybe you've started setting boundaries. Maybe you've stopped apologizing for everything. Maybe you're succeeding at work. Maybe you're happier than you've ever been. And suddenly, out of nowhere, they smile. Oh, remember when everyone laughed at you? Or, I still can't believe how pathetic you looked that day. Or maybe they say it jokingly, just loud enough for everyone else to hear. The room laughs, you freeze, and instantly, your confidence collapses. Have you ever wondered why their timing feels almost supernatural? Because they're not randomly bringing up your past, they're targeting your present. Your humiliation is simply the tool. Your confidence is the actual target. That is why narcissistic abuse feels so confusing. People often think abuse always looks like yelling, insults, or obvious aggression. But psychological abuse is different. Sometimes it looks like a joke. Sometimes it sounds like concern. Sometimes it arrives disguised as nostalgia. We were just remembering that funny thing you did. Funny for whom? Certainly not for you. What makes these moments so painful isn't just the memory itself, it's the emotional time travel. Your brain doesn't simply remember embarrassment, it briefly relives it. Your heart races, your stomach tightens, your face becomes warm, you feel exposed all over again. A narcissist understands this instinctively, maybe not consciously, but they know it works, and because it works, they keep doing it. Here's something many survivors don't realize. The narcissist isn't necessarily obsessed with your humiliation. They're obsessed with the emotional reaction it produces. Notice what happens immediately after they remind you. Do they comfort you? Do they apologize? Do they change the subject? Rarely. Instead, they watch, almost like they're studying your face, looking for signs. Did your smile disappear? Did your voice become quieter? Did your confidence shrink? Did you start explaining yourself? Because that's the moment they were actually waiting for, not the story, the reaction. Psychologists often describe narcissistic relationships as power-based relationships rather than love-based relationships. Power doesn't always require physical strength. Sometimes power simply means controlling another person's emotional state. If I can make you feel ashamed, I can influence your behavior. If I can make you question yourself, I become more important than your own judgment. If I can pull you back into old pain, you become easier to control today. That's why they rarely attack your greatest strengths. Think about it. If you're intelligent, they probably won't argue with your IQ. If you're successful, they'll search for the one time you failed. If you're attractive, they'll remind you about the one person who rejected you. If you're confident, they'll mention the one mistake you can't forget. Why? Because confidence built over years can sometimes be shaken by a single unresolved memory. And narcissists know exactly where those memories live. Let's go even deeper. Many people believe narcissists have incredible memories. But notice something interesting. They don't remember birthdays. They forget promises. They ignore your achievements. They overlook anniversaries. Yet somehow, they perfectly remember every embarrassing thing you've ever done. That isn't because they have perfect memory. It's because emotional ammunition receives special treatment. Their brain automatically catalogs information that can preserve control later. It's almost like creating a psychological filing cabinet. Folder 1, your insecurities. Folder 2, your fears. Folder 3, your failures. Folder 4, the moments you cried, and whenever they feel threatened, they simply open the appropriate folder. That's why survivors often say, "It's like they always knew exactly what to say to hurt me." Because they did, not through magic, through observation. Narcissists are often incredibly attentive during moments of vulnerability. Ironically, the moment you believe they're finally listening, they're collecting data. Think back to a time you cried in front of someone who later used your tears against you. At the time, you probably felt relieved. You thought, "Finally, someone understands me." But months later, during an argument, everything you shared suddenly returned, only this time, as evidence against you. You've always been emotionally unstable. No wonder people leave you. You've always been too sensitive. Can you see what happened? Your healing conversation quietly became their future script. One of the most painful realizations survivors experience is understanding that empathy was being imitated rather than genuinely felt. Because authentic empathy protects vulnerability, false empathy stores it. And that difference changes the entire relationship. Here's another pattern worth noticing. Narcissists rarely invent your deepest insecurities. They reflect them back. If you're secretly afraid of being abandoned, that's the button they'll press. If you're ashamed about your past, that's the story they'll repeat. If you worry you're not good enough, that's the belief they'll reinforce. Why? Because lies require effort. Your existing fears require almost none. It's much easier to convince someone of something they already fear might be true. That's psychological manipulation at its most efficient. Imagine planting a tiny seed inside someone's mind. Years later, you don't need to plant another. You simply water the original one. That's exactly how emotional humiliation works. The narcissist isn't creating shame from nothing. They're feeding shame that already exists. And the stronger that shame becomes, the smaller you begin to feel. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about. Every time they remind you of your humiliation, they're secretly trying to escape their own. This is projection. Narcissists often carry enormous hidden shame beneath their grand appearance. They desperately need to believe they're superior because the alternative feels unbearable. So instead of facing their own flaws, they spotlight yours. Instead of processing their own embarrassment, they resurrect yours. Instead of confronting their own failures, they replay yours again and again. In other words, every insult they throw becomes a distraction from the person they fear becoming themselves. But because this happens beneath conscious awareness, they genuinely believe you're the problem. That's why arguing rarely changes anything. Logic cannot compete with unconscious defense mechanisms. You may spend hours explaining why something hurt you. They'll respond with, "It was just a joke," or "You're too sensitive," or "You need to learn to laugh at yourself." Notice how accountability disappears every single time, because admitting cruelty would require confronting shame. And shame is exactly what they're running from, so they hand it back to you instead. Like passing a burning coal. If you hold it, they feel relief. If you refuse to hold it, something inside the narcissist begins to panic. Because without your shame, they're left alone with their own. Without your shame, they're left alone with emotions they've spent years trying to avoid. And that's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because what feels like an attack on your past is often triggered by something happening in the present. Think about the last time someone suddenly reminded you of an embarrassing moment. What had happened just before that? Had you disagreed with them, set a boundary, received praise from someone else, started spending less time with them, become more confident? In many relationships involving narcissistic traits, these moments aren't random. They often appear when the other person senses a shift in the balance of attention, influence, or control. Your old humiliation becomes a shortcut to making you question yourself again. Imagine standing on a stage. For years, you've practiced speaking. You've overcome anxiety. You've built confidence one small step at a time. Just as you're about to begin your best speech, someone in the audience shouts, "Remember the time you froze in front of everyone?" Suddenly, your mind is no longer in the present. It's back in that painful memory. Your hands tighten. Your breathing changes. For a moment, you stop seeing who you've become and start seeing who you used to be. That is why unresolved shame is so powerful. It doesn't simply remind you of the past. It temporarily replaces the present. Emotionally manipulative people often understand this effect, whether consciously or intuitively. They don't always need to insult you directly. Sometimes all they have to do is reopen an old emotional wound. Notice how subtle it can be. "I'm just telling the story. I thought everyone would find it funny. I didn't know you were still upset about that." On the surface, these statements sound harmless, but context matters. If the story consistently leaves one person feeling embarrassed while another enjoys the attention it creates, it's worth asking what purpose the story is really serving. Healthy relationships don't depend on keeping someone's worst moments alive. Healthy people naturally notice growth. They see how far you've come. They celebrate the person you've become, rather than trapping you inside the person you once were. Someone who genuinely cares might say, "I remember how hard that was for you. I'm proud of how much you've grown." Compare that with, "I'll never let you forget what you did." Those two sentences come from completely different emotional places. One creates safety, the other creates fear. And fear has a remarkable effect on human behavior. When people feel ashamed, they often become easier to influence. They apologize more quickly. They explain themselves more often. They hesitate before speaking. They become afraid of making another mistake. Over time, they may begin editing their own personality just to avoid another painful reminder. This is one reason chronic humiliation can be so damaging. It slowly changes how people see themselves. Instead of asking, "What do I want?" they begin asking, "What can I do to avoid being criticized again?" That shift is enormous, because the moment your life becomes organized around avoiding someone else's reactions, you've stopped living from your own values. You're living from their approval. And approval that depends on keeping you small is never genuine acceptance. Here's another pattern survivors often recognize only after leaving the relationship. The embarrassing stories are rarely shared equally. Your mistakes become public entertainment. Their mistakes become private secrets. If you accidentally said something awkward 5 years ago, everyone hears about it. If they lied, manipulated someone, broke a promise, or acted selfishly, suddenly privacy becomes very important. This double standard isn't unique to narcissism, but it is common in emotionally unhealthy relationships. Accountability flows in one direction. The spotlight points toward you. The curtain protects them. Now ask yourself another question. Have you ever noticed how differently they react when you mention one of their embarrassing moments? Perhaps you were gentle. Perhaps you weren't trying to hurt them. Yet their response seemed completely out of proportion. They became angry, defensive, cold, or they immediately changed the subject. Sometimes they even accused you of attacking them. Why? Because many people who rely heavily on protecting their self-image experience criticism, even mild criticism, as far more threatening than most people do. The same humiliation they repeatedly hand to others can feel unbearable when directed toward themselves. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it helps explain why these interactions can feel so one-sided. They may expect emotional resilience from everyone around them while struggling to tolerate it themselves. This imbalance creates confusion. You begin thinking, if they hate being embarrassed this much, why would they embarrass someone else? Because empathy and self-protection aren't always operating at the same level. When self-image becomes the highest priority, protecting it can overshadow concern for how another person feels. And that's why survivors often describe these relationships as emotionally exhausting. The rules keep changing. Your feelings are questioned. Their feelings become unquestionable. Your memories are debated. Their version of events becomes the only acceptable version. Eventually, something else begins to happen. You stop trusting your own emotional reactions. After enough comments like, "You're too sensitive," "You're imagining things," "You're overreacting," many people start wondering whether their pain is even real. This self-doubt can become one of the deepest wounds left behind, because confidence isn't only about believing you're capable, it's also about believing your own experience. When that trust is repeatedly undermined, people may spend years second-guessing themselves. And ironically, that's exactly what makes old humiliations even more powerful. If you no longer trust your own perspective, you'll naturally give more weight to theirs. Even when you know the story is unfair, even when you know they've exaggerated it, even when everyone else has forgotten, you remember it because they kept reminding you, until it felt like your identity instead of your history. But here's the truth many survivors discover during healing. The event itself was never the biggest problem. The repetition was. Everyone has embarrassing moments. Everyone has failed. Everyone has cried. Everyone has made decisions they wish they could undo. Those experiences are part of being human. What turns them into emotional prisons is hearing them repeated over and over by someone who benefits from keeping them alive. And once you recognize that pattern, something remarkable begins to happen. The story slowly loses its power because you stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" And you begin asking, "Why does this person need me to keep reliving it?" That single question changes everything. It shifts your attention away from defending your past and toward understanding the unhealthy dynamic unfolding in the present. And when that shift happens, the emotional grip starts to weaken. For the first time, you realize that the most important chapter isn't the embarrassing moment itself. It's what you choose to believe about yourself after someone keeps trying to define you by it. And that realization opens the door to something many emotionally manipulative people never expect. Someone who is no longer willing to carry shame that doesn't belong to them. Someone who is no longer willing to carry shame that doesn't belong to them. And that is the moment everything begins to change. Not because the past disappears, not because the memories magically stop hurting, but because you finally understand a truth that was hidden from you for so long. A painful memory and a painful identity are not the same thing. One is something that happened. The other is a story someone keeps trying to convince you to believe. For years, you may have confused the two. Every time they brought up that embarrassing mistake, it felt as though they were revealing your true self. But they weren't revealing who you are. They were selectively replaying one scene from a much larger story. Imagine judging an entire movie from a single frame. One awkward expression, one mistake, one fall. Would that tell you everything about the character? Of course not. Yet that's exactly what emotionally manipulative people often do. They reduce an entire human being to one painful moment because it's easier to control someone who believes they're permanently broken than someone who believes they're growing. Healthy relationships don't freeze you in time. They make room for change. They recognize that people mature, heal, learn, apologize, and evolve. The healthiest people in your life won't constantly remind you of the person you were years ago. They'll notice the person you're becoming today. Think about someone you genuinely respect. If they told you about a mistake they made 10 years ago, would you keep bringing it up every time you wanted to win an argument? Probably not. Because respect naturally protects another person's dignity. Humiliation does the opposite. It chips away at dignity one comment at a time, sometimes loudly, sometimes subtly, sometimes disguised as humor, sometimes hidden inside a remember when. But regardless of how it's delivered, repeated humiliation sends the same message. You don't deserve to outgrow your past. That message can quietly shape someone's entire life. People stop applying for opportunities because they fear failing again. They avoid relationships because they believe they're unworthy. They stay silent because they're afraid of looking foolish. Over time, the prison isn't built from the original mistake. It's built from the belief that they'll never be allowed to move beyond it. And that's why healing isn't about erasing your memories. It's about changing your relationship with them. The day you stop seeing your worst moment as proof of your worth is the day it begins losing its power. Here's something many survivors eventually realize. The people who truly love you don't need you to be perfect to respect you. They don't keep score. They don't maintain an emotional archive of every mistake you've ever made. When conflict happens, they address the present issue instead of dragging 10 years of history into the conversation. That's emotional maturity. It doesn't deny the past. It simply refuses to weaponize it. Now ask yourself one final question. When someone repeatedly reminds you of your lowest moments, what are they hoping you'll forget? Perhaps it's your resilience. Perhaps it's how much you've grown. Perhaps it's the boundaries you've started setting. Perhaps it's the confidence you've rebuilt piece by piece. Because confidence changes relationships. When you no longer see yourself through the lens of shame, unhealthy dynamics become much harder to maintain. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop explaining every decision. You stop chasing approval that never arrives. Most importantly, you stop believing that your value can be measured by someone else's opinion of your past. That doesn't mean you'll never feel hurt again. Old memories may still sting. A familiar comment may still catch you off guard. Healing isn't the absence of emotion. It's the presence of perspective. Instead of thinking, they mentioned my mistake. Maybe they're right about me. You begin thinking, they're mentioning my mistake again. Why is that still so important to them? That shift is incredibly powerful because it moves the spotlight. For years, the spotlight stayed on your embarrassment. Now it moves toward the unhealthy pattern itself. And once you recognize the pattern, you gain something they can no longer control. Choice. You can choose not to defend yourself. You can choose not to relive the moment. You can choose not to argue over a version of yourself that no longer exists. Sometimes the strongest response isn't a perfect comeback. It's refusing to let someone else decide which chapter of your life defines the whole book. Every human being has chapters they'd rather forget. Moments of fear, moments of failure, moments of heartbreak, moments of regret. But those chapters exist alongside countless others. Acts of courage, moments of kindness, lessons learned, dreams pursued, people helped, challenges overcome, growth earned. No emotionally healthy person reads only the darkest page and claims they've understood the entire story. So don't do that to yourself either. The person who stumbled is not the only version of you. The person who cried is not the only version of you. The person who trusted the wrong individual is not the only version of you. Those were moments, not identities. And perhaps that's the greatest fear of anyone who relies on shame to influence others. The day you truly believe that. Because once you stop introducing yourself to the world through your wounds, no one can use those wounds to define you anymore. Your past becomes a teacher instead of a prison. Your mistakes become lessons instead of labels. Your scars become evidence that you survived, not evidence that you failed. And that's the quiet transformation many people never see coming. You don't become stronger because your past disappears. You become stronger because it no longer controls the way you see yourself. One day, someone may try to reopen an old wound. They may repeat the same story, use the same joke, bring up the same embarrassing memory they thought would always silence you. But this time, something feels different. You don't panic. You don't shrink. You don't rush to explain yourself because you finally realize something they never wanted you to know. The most humiliating moment of your life was never the most important moment of your life. It was simply one page. And no one, not a manipulative partner, not a toxic friend, not a difficult family member, not anyone, has the authority to decide that one page is the entire story of who you are. That decision belongs to you, always has, and always will. If this message resonated with you, remember this. Your past explains you, but it does not define you. The people who genuinely care about you will encourage your growth, not imprison you inside your old mistakes. And the moment you stop carrying shame that was never meant to be yours, you begin reclaiming something far more valuable than anyone's approval. You begin reclaiming yourself.